So, Dr. Bowman.
Well, thanks very much, Linda, and hopefully the microphone won't overwhelm you all. I'm super loud, so if I need to step back or something or be quiet, just please feel free to let me know. I'm really excited to be here, and this is a little weird for me. You know, historians don't usually talk about living people, let alone living people who are sitting in the audience. So if I mess any of this up, Wayne, please correct me. Hopefully I won't. And a bit of a caveat, this is a work in progress, and I'm really excited to talk about this because this is the first time I've got a completed, or close to completed manuscript about Wayne's story, but I've never spoken on it before. So this for me is an opportunity to test out some ideas and, you know, generate a little conversation, perhaps even get some feedback should you feel so inclined. So I'll look forward to the Q&A. And in fact, I don't, you know, as a historian, I don't really consider myself much of a lecturer, to be honest. So if you have a comment or a question or something as I'm speaking, I don't mind at all a hand being raised. Hopefully I'm not violating some kind of policy in saying that. I feel like ideas in history are better when they're, you know, a conversation as opposed to a lecture. So please feel free to. Oh, hey, no, speak up, please. I'm happy to speak to whatever issues may come up. And the number one conversation starter in America in 2018, which is Donald Trump, believe it or not. Hopefully that's not too much of a surprise, but it makes sense. So bear with me here if you can. So, you know, I think like many of you, I didn't see Donald Trump's victory coming in November 2016, right? I mean, who did? You know, when I walked out of the polling station in Canyon, I assumed, like a lot of people, and I know we've got people of different political persuasions here, but a lot of people who lean more toward the left, like I do, I assumed that I just cast my ballot for someone who was assured to become the first woman president in U.S. history. And I was shocked that night when she lost. I really was. And, well, why did she lose? Part of the reason why she lost, I think, is that historians don't really take conservatism seriously. And I really sincerely mean that. Part of the problem is, you know, you hear the charge from conservatives that there's liberal bias in the academy. That's actually kind of true in certain ways. And part of this is also because people like me who go on to get Ph.D.s in modern American history or Southwestern history or whatever, we tend to be trained by people who come from the coasts, right? The elite institutions of the coast, which are dominated by people who happen to be liberal. And this is a problem in my field. Historians, I think, have failed the American public in that we have investigated liberalism far more critically than we have conservatism. And this is a real problem. Now, this isn't just a problem in the United States, I don't think. This is a problem in the Western world generally. It's no coincidence to me, I don't think, that, for example, there we go, that Brexit, which shocked a lot of people, and Donald Trump happened at like the same time, and nobody saw either of these phenomena coming. That's something that both of them have in common, but it runs a little deeper than that, I think. And this is something that I've come to realize in looking into Wayne's story, which I'll get into in a minute, and talking about what happened to him in Hereford. One of the things I think that Brexit and Trump have in common, aside from the fact that nobody thought either of these things could happen, is these are about the reassertion of something that can perhaps be imperfectly called a working class nationalism in the United States and across the pond in England, right? Brexit is about, obviously, Britain first, leaving the European Union, as this cartoon shows. At the same time, Trump is also about a resurgent American nationalism. Make America Great Again. Sounds an awful lot like Britain First, right? Trade barriers, raising tariffs to protect American producers, which a lot of economists would say flies in the face of current economic theory. My own field of borderlands history, a lot of borderlands historians would tell you that border walls don't work. If you look at the Maginot Line or the Great Wall of China, which didn't keep the Mongols out, right? They just don't work, but that's not, them working isn't really what it's about. It's about speaking to a nationalism that liberals have kind of ignored, I think. So, in other words, historians, in my view, have got to start taking conservatism much more seriously than they do. And the way this relates to Wayne, who's sitting here in the audience, is, I think, and hopefully some of this will come across well, some of these ideas may seem a little disconnected, hopefully that's not the case, is I think that what happened to Wayne in the 70s can say a lot about conservatism in the Panhandle. And it can also say a lot, I think, about why Donald Trump in particular is so popular here. So that's really what I want to get at tonight. So a little bit of a backstory. So Wayne emailed me, I guess it was about December of 2015, so maybe 2 years ago. I didn't know who he was. I'd never heard of him before. And then he sent me this short little email and said, I've got this really interesting story, and I want a historian or a writer to take a look at this. He claimed not to be a writer, that he didn't want to write his story himself. And I was intrigued. So I'll get to the details of his story here in a minute. So we had coffee up at the Barnes & Noble on Sauncey. We talked a little bit about his story, and of course one of the burning questions that I had as a historian is, do you have the documents? I can't base everything on discussions, and fortunately for me, he had saved a bunch of documents from this dramatic event that had happened in his life in the 70s, and that was great. So I decided to get into to do this, to write about Wayne and his story. And it became immediately apparent to me that there was a whole book project here. At first, I kind of thought, well, you know, maybe this is something that could be in the Texas Monthly or some other type of publication, trade publication or whatever. But there's a book, and there's a good book, I think. And I think part of the significance of Wayne's life and Wayne's experiences in Hereford bears directly on, again, what I've spoken about thus far. Neoliberals, as well as academics' larger inability to grasp the things that have driven conservative populism in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. So I'll kind of circle back around to that point later. Ma'am?
I don't know who Wayne is.
Oh, yes. So this is Mr. Wayne Woodward sitting right here. Wayne, do you want to say hi? He's a member here. Yeah, I apologize. I sort of assume everybody knows Wayne. He's a really nice guy.
And his association with Hereford?
I'll get to that. Yeah, I'll get to that. Okay. Well, in fact, I'll get to that right now. Why not? Okay. So in 1975, Wayne had been teaching for a few years at La Plata Junior High School in Hereford, which is now Hereford Middle School, which I know Larry teaches at, and a couple of other people are associated with the school are here today. And Wayne had been there for, I guess, about 6 years at that point. And in January of that year, Wayne decided to start a chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which is an organization that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Now, some of you are laughing already, so you can sort of see where this is going, right? A bit of a misfit, that's right, yeah. Now, Wayne also did this with the help of a local Catholic priest named Father Jose Gilligan, who unfortunately is no longer with us, and I would have loved to have gotten the chance to speak with him. And those of you who know Wayne will agree with me that Wayne's an intelligent guy. At the time, he was young and idealistic, and little could he have known how making such a seemingly innocuous decision in Hereford in 1975 would alter the course of his entire life. All right, so let me make sure I've got the right thing here. This is unfortunately the only picture of the school that I could find at the time. This is, I think, the Masonic Lodge laying a cornerstone to a new addition to the building, but there you go. So, all right, so as far as Wayne's story goes, he had been there since, if I'm not mistaken, and Wayne, please feel free to correct me here, since 1969. he made, unfortunately for him, two initial mistakes. One, he rolled into town with a California license plate. That's not good in Hereford in the late 60s. Of course, he would have had no way of knowing that. Number two, he had kind of long hair. Now, when I say long hair, I don't mean he had hair like down his back. He had hair like sort of covering his ears, sort of halfway down his ears. So, of course, you roll into town with long hair and a California license plate in Hereford in the 60s, what are the people of Hereford going to think? Well, that's a hippie, right? That's a young troublemaker. Even if those labels weren't accurate to who Wayne was as a young man then in his mid-20s, and I think based on some conversations Wayne and I have had, he wouldn't have identified that way at all. But nonetheless, he was visually marked that way when he came into the town. Now, Wayne was an English teacher at La Plata, and he was quite popular with his students. He was, young and outgoing and energetic. Of course, students always respond really well to that type of teacher. He challenged his students. He taught controversial texts like 1984, Orwell's classic, Black Like Me, which would have been even more controversial in Hereford perhaps than 1984. Wayne, in conversations that I've had with him, has told me that he was anti-Vietnam. Of course, it's in 69 at the height of the war. That probably didn't go over well with some people, but discussed the Vietnam War with some of his students. He didn't really go to church in those days. Of course, that would have marked him as different in Hereford. He had a penchant for questioning authority, of course, like any original thinker in history does. And these traits, of course, caused him to run afoul of a couple of administrators at the school. Perhaps most notably a gentleman by the name of Pat Hughes, who unfortunately is also no longer with us, who I would love to speak to, who eventually became his principal. And on a number of occasions, Hughes reminded Wayne that he lived in the Bible Belt and that he needed to work harder to fit in Hereford, to become a member of the community or a part of the community. Now, getting back to the ACLU, I can't really explain why conservatives hate the ACLU as much as they do. There probably is an explanation, I think, and maybe I need to read a little more into the history of the organization itself. But I think I can explain why conservatives in Hereford hated the ACLU in the 70s in particular. So a lot of people don't know, and I was actually surprised to learn this when I first became familiar with the history of Hereford, that Hereford, as early as 1962, was a majority-minority town. That was something that was exceptionally rare in the Texas Panhandle in those days. Hereford had become reliant upon migrant labor, so ethnic Mexicans, Mexican Americans from South Texas, but also people from across the border. Some of these would have been guest workers in the famous Bracero program, which was a guest worker agreement between the United States and Mexico from the World War II era. Of course, some of these would have been undocumented people. And these are people who had propped up Hereford agribusiness in the post-World War II era, which hadn't existed before World War II. Now, of course, some of you who are familiar with Hereford will know a little bit about the Hereford migrant labor camp, which still exists today. Of course, during World War II, this was a prisoner of war internment camp. I think it was Italian POWs, yeah, right, who were there. But the agribusiness interest in Hereford transformed this into housing the ethnic Mexican population of the city. Okay, so hold that thought for a minute. Okay, so Hereford was reliant upon Mexican agricultural workers, and of course, challenging the racial order is a part of the title that I have today. But Herefordites, I'm not really sure if that's the proper term for the town, really didn't like outsiders in the 60s. I don't know if they do or if they don't today, but they definitely didn't back then. And this can be seen in a number of ways. Hereford is, in fact, right smack in the middle of a part of the country that some historians of the 60s and 70s have referred to as the hippie highway, right? So these are hippies from the eastern United States who are, of course, going out west to places like San Francisco, the hippie capital of the, am I too loud? Okay, yeah, I had a feeling that would be the case. Who were traveling west to California. So imagine being in Hereford and seeing these types coming through town in the late 1960s. And one of the things that I've uncovered, this was pretty shocking to me, is that a number of these people who would, of course, sort of camp out on public lands as they were going west to California, who were hitchhiking the whole way, smoking pot, doing whatever else they were doing. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Of course, a lot of these people in Hereford got arrested. And what would happen when they were camped out in public lands is they would get arrested, they would wind up in the jail, and there was this weird phenomenon of police officers shaving their heads as like a form of punishment, probably because, a lot of these guys had long hair, and that was obnoxious to a lot of conservative people in those days, taking them in squad cars, escorting them to the limits of the city, and telling them not to come back. So why is that relevant? Okay, well, it's relevant because Wayne worked in Hereford at La Plata for about 6 years before he got essentially run out of town, like the hippies did. He was, I think, to the people of Hereford, or to some of the people of Hereford, he was a stand-in for a lot of the sort of cultural liberalism that was taking shape in the United States, or a seeming stand-in, but he was generally tolerated, even though he questioned authority, taught controversial books, got into trouble with his administrators a couple of times. He was tolerated until his creation of the Hereford chapter of the ACLU. So the ACLU is really important in his story. So long story short, and I'm summarizing a lot of complicated things here that happened in Wayne's life, Principal Hughes, essentially, this is a bit of an oversimplification, accused him of trying to recruit students to join the ACLU while he was in class and passing out literature and all this kind of stuff, which was not true. So in those days, and I think this is true in a lot of school districts now, teachers have their contracts renewed annually, right? So if a district wants to get rid of a teacher, they just don't renew the contract, and then that person has to leave. So Hughes used this trumped-up charge as a pretext for not renewing Wayne's contract to try to get rid of him, to get him out of Hereford. So immediately after the completion of the spring of the 1975 semester, Wayne, who was a popular teacher, he was effective, he was highly regarded by the students, they loved his classes. I've read some of his student evaluations, they were better than mine at WT. He was suddenly unemployed. Now, of course, what a lot of people would do in those situations is they would just leave and go somewhere else. But Wayne, one of the qualities that I respect about him, is a fighter. He didn't want to let that go. So what Wayne did is he hired a lawyer, and he sued the school district on the grounds that his First Amendment rights had been violated. So the case was tried in the district court here in Amarillo, and he won. The judge found in his favor. Now, of course, what the administrators then did is they appealed the decision to the appeals court, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, and at which point the two sides settled out of court. But clearly Wayne had won in a court of law. Now, this whole story was really fascinating to me. And as a historian, what I have to do, and what I always tell my students they have to do, is to explain the larger significance of historical events. And what instantly jumped out at me, despite how interesting Wayne is as a guy and as an individual and as a historical figure, what really fascinated me was the people who did this to him. So in other words, how could these so-called upstanding good Americans who lived in the rural United States trample on someone's civil liberties, on his First Amendment rights, and think that that was an okay thing to do, that they could get away with that and that they could win in a court of law? So this project that I've undertaken is in large part about explaining that. How these people thought they could get away with this and what that means. I think that's a really fascinating question. So it's obviously got something to do with the ACLU in particular. That seems clear. Now, there are two things here that I think these people found so threatening about this ACLU chapter being founded in their town. One was that the leadership of the ACLU then and now were proponents of student activism. And of course, going back to the 50s, I mean, student activism was one of the hallmarks of the 50s and 60s and 70s. And here you have before you an image of Mario Salvo, who was the head of the free speech movement at Berkeley, which was, of course, a very liberal place, getting rushed off and arrested by the cops. People in Hereford didn't want to see this kind of thing happen. They didn't want to see students asserting their rights against the perceived authority of people in the town or in the schools. Okay. Second, and perhaps more importantly than that, is the word union in American Civil Liberties Union. And this is where labor and race, I think, comes into play. If the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, was started by a Catholic priest in a labor camp and a young idealistic teacher who had a penchant for hanging out with that priest, then there was a threat here that these men could organize the town's ethnic Mexican majority to assert their rights. And of course, if you know anything about migrant labor, you'll know that people who immigrate from Mexico or from South Texas are heavily exploited and not protected. I could be wrong about this, but not protected by federal labor law even today in 2018. Now, the racial order and the economy of Hereford depended so much on exploiting cheap migrant laborers as the backbone of the local economy that this tumult of 60s liberalism and the arrival of the ACLU in the town that Wayne represented could actually have been a real threat if people started asserting their rights and asking for better wages or better living conditions in the Hereford migrant labor camps. So, ironically, in terms of the ACLU being a threat, they might not really have been wrong. That's one thing that I would suggest. Now, okay, so in terms of larger significance here, which is what really fascinates me, Wayne's story is obviously bigger than all of just this sort of microscopic local stuff that happened in Hereford in the 60s and 70s. Of course, it was during this time that scores of Americans took notice when African Americans had begun forging new grounds for racial equality in the United States. Mexican Americans, of course, the farm workers movement under Cesar Chavez had started in 1965. The Chicano movement, which was a radical leftist movement, had started right around the time Wayne came to Hereford. The feminist movement was, of course, in full swing. Members of what's now termed the LGBTQIA community and also a host of other groups have become reinvigorated in their own quests for justice and equality and belonging in the United States. So all of this that was happening in Hereford happened within the larger context of this new emphasis on multiplicity and diversity in American culture. This was a new era for the United States, of course, but it was one that was rocky and fraught with a lot of difficulty and made a lot of people very, very nervous. So many people in rural America, places like Hereford or other places in the plains, were shocked at all of this. Now, I mentioned that historians have not taken conservative people in this time period seriously. In fact, one of the few historians who has studied conservatism in this region, who actually never even published his work, wrote, and this is a quote, "Millions of Americans watched the transformation of American political culture between the 1930s and 1970s, and they did so with a strange mixture, of disbelief, horror, amazement, anger, and confusion. America, it seemed, was slipping away from them." So, what is it about these people that historians who tend to be liberal have gotten wrong? Well, conservatism, I don't think, in my view, in contextualizing Wayne's story within the local history of the Panhandle in the 60s and 70s, I don't think it's quite as reactionary as it's often depicted. What you tend to get about conservatism in the literature is that it was a reaction against the so-called age of limits in the 1970s. The New Deal state was starting to run out. The economy had finally taken a downturn after it was at its greatest heights in the 1950s, the best economy the United States had ever had and probably ever will have. What I've discovered, I think, in thinking about Wayne's story and contextualizing it, is that, and bear with me here, because this may sound a little weird at first, is that a version of a sort of a 19th century American exceptionalism became nurtured in the Texas Panhandle. This was a place that was often referred to as the last frontier by regional boosters. That kind of literature is not hard to find if you visit the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. And that this happened because of the region's relative geographic isolation from the rest of the United States, as well as, I would suggest, locals' perceptions that the Panhandle was a place set apart from the rest of the country. In some ways, I think they may have been right, that it was set apart. This exceptionalist nature of Panhandle political identity fostered a perception over time that the people of the region knew what was in their own best interests, as opposed to outsiders or the U.S. government, or in the 60s or 70s, liberals, because a lot of people thought liberalism is not native to this region. This is a coastal or urban phenomenon, or whatever. So, community or even cultural guardianism, this is one of the things that I've come to find, became woven into the region's fabric. Now, that's not to say, of course, that the Panhandle was always adverse to an outside presence here in the region. There's a long history of outsiders coming into the, outsiders, it's got such a negative connotation, right? But outsiders coming into the region and doing a lot of good. So, for example, one of the few things that's been written, that reams have been written on in the 20th century in Panhandle history, is the history of ranching, right? Which is important in its own right. Well, if you look at the history of ranching, as early as the late 19th century, these were not small individual people who were coming in. Ranchers that were coming into the Panhandle were coming in with the backing of big capital from Chicago or New York or even England. The Populist Party, of course, held a certain appeal to small farmers and ranchers as early as the 1890s. And of course, this was something that wasn't native to the region. And in fact, I think a more pressing example might be Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. So the father of modern liberalism in the 1930s carried the Panhandle, and many Panhandle Texans at the time would admit that the New Deal did a great deal of good for local farming and ranching during the 1930s, and that would be anathema, I think, to what a lot of people think now. So, despite that, and despite that Roosevelt, who there's plenty of things to criticize about President Roosevelt as a historian, don't get me wrong. Despite that he did do a lot of good in the 30s, I don't want to downplay the importance of the 1930s to the political and cultural history of this region, because it is critically important. There was a shift during the 1930s in that Panhandle Texans began to feel that outside influences in this region, which generally prospered economically, and one of the things that actually really shocks me about the Panhandle in the 30s is that even at the height of the Dust Bowl, the Panhandle prospered relative to other parts of the state. Ranchers were still making millions of dollars every year. Were making a lot more money than people in Central Texas or South Texas or even to the west in New Mexico or Oklahoma. There was this idea that the federal government seemed to know best how to govern local affairs. And I think that that's true. When people in this, I don't think that the federal government knew how best. I think that locals who noticed something that was correct. There was some liberal condescension here in the 30s with the New Deal. So the roots of what I'm calling in Wayne's project, this sort of martial, aggressive, manly, populist conservatism really do lay here in the 1930s in particular. And of course, I think they're really gaining a lot of expression under Donald Trump. But none of that is to say that conservatism here is solely reactionary to the politics of the welfare state or the New Deal. So a number of things drove local conservative identity or regional conservative identity, for lack of a better term, or a term that I don't have yet. This sense of isolationism and this economic prosperity that is clear in the Panhandle was important. The geographic isolation that the Panhandle is a place that's kind of cut off from the rest of the country was also important. That reinforced people's notions that we know how to govern our own local affairs here best. And then, of course, the Democratic Party's embracing of racial and identity politics also further served this coalescence here. Of course, a lot of people who are native to the Panhandle didn't want to see things like this occurring in the Panhandle. Now, despite the fact that Hereford was a majority-minority town, most of the Panhandle was not. The Panhandle had an overwhelming Anglo white American for a Caucasian demographic majority here through the 1970s. But by the 1970s, this aggressive conservatism based on a sense of place, grounded in a notion that this region stood as an exception to the winds of national politics, expressed itself in a community and sort of moral guardianism against allegedly threatening ideas and people. So in other words, Wayne's case in 1975 against the power brokers of Hereford, I think, is a testament to this larger phenomenon, that people still wanted to protect the Panhandle from liberalism, be it cultural liberalism or the condescension of the federal government or whatever. So I'm going to jump around a little bit for the remainder of my time here. Hopefully this will make sense and not seem too disjointed. So a little bit about politics and culture in the Panhandle. Hereford was distinct, I think, even within the realm of the history of conservatism in the 20th century. Of course, it was part of the Sun Belt, or is part of the Sun Belt, I should say, right? And that's a term that we use to describe the region of the United States. I should have had a map. I'm sorry that I don't. Stretching from Florida to California, that rose to demographic and economic and political prominence only in the post-World War II era in the modern history of the United States. This stems from a number of factors, of course. Eisenhower's military-industrial complex of the 1950s, the fact that, you know, we have air conditioning in the 50s now, so, you know, who in the hell wants to live in Phoenix in the 1920s or whatever? And what this allowed for, of course, was people who were snowbirds. So my family's Canadian. I have a number of snowbirds in my own family who come down here from the north when it's really cold, who tend to vote, or historically at least have tended to vote more conservatively than they have liberally. This drove a lot of the political change in this region. The coalescence of the conservative Republican Party, of course, is tied directly to this region. I mean, look no further, of course, than this is Barry Goldwater here on the left, who ran for president in 1964 and got clobbered by Lyndon Baines Johnson, but was probably the first modern economic conservative to run for the presidency and laid the groundwork for his friend here, who we obviously all know, Ronald Reagan, who became president and brought together the conservative coalition with his electoral victory in 1980. Now, the Panhandle is related to all of this, of course, regionally, but it's still distinct, I would argue. The Panhandle, in fact, I think serves as a sort of a political borderlands in the Sun Belt, sort of an area that's between the conservative U.S. South and the conservative areas of Southern California. One of the ideas that I'm working with is that the tumult of the Great Depression actually connected a lot of Panhandle conservatism to the flowering of this conservative movement in Arizona and California. So it's no coincidence, I think, that the Okies and the Arkies, to use Steinbeck's term from his famous novel Grapes of Wrath, who left from this region to California, spread some of their ideas to that part of the country. Now, prior to this, conservatism in Southern California basically meant being an anti-communist, which was sort of how Ronald Reagan kind of cut his teeth. But the Depression years sent scores of these so-called Okies to California and helped spread what some anthropologists call the sort of Southern plain folk culture or evangelism of this region to the West Coast, in turn reorienting Southern California conservatism back to the middle of the country. So Steinbeck's Okies and Arkies, I think, are a lot more important than most people really realize. This deep sense of protecting these plain folk values of rural America, though, is a distinct contribution that the people in Hereford, as well as other more isolated communities on the plains, made in the emerging conservative movement, given their location at this so-called sending end of this conservative diaspora that I think a lot of historians have really missed. It's no coincidence, for example, that if you read works written by conservatives themselves from the 60s that they would count Orange County, California, and Randall County, Texas as two of the most fertile grounds for recruitment for conservative causes. I think this is the reason why. But Hereford's relative geographic isolation meant that its experiences of politics and culture during this sort of tumultuous mid-period of the 20th century from the 30s to the 70s were different. They played out differently, even in places where these political outlooks leaned overwhelmingly to the right. The sense that you've got to protect a community from a dangerous idea isn't really something that you see in California. You see more of an idea of protecting America and Americanism from communists and troublemakers, but you don't see people saying we've got to protect Long Beach or whatever. But you do see this kind of idea here. So this community guardianism, I think, is something that's really unique to the Panhandle. There's, of course, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, there's, of course, a gendered element to all of this that you don't see in places like Southern California, where, of course, there were plenty of prominent women who were speaking out for conservative causes. In Wayne's story in particular, his antagonists were always men, or almost always men, who were power brokers in the city. And, of course, this, I think, in part stems from generations of men who protected this so-called last frontier in the United States from a multitude of threats, whatever they were, Indians in the 19th century or gunslingers in the early 20th century or what have you. Protecting communities here was always the province of powerful and well-connected men in particular. Now, another part of why all of this is important, I think, is, again, just sort of circling back to some ideas that I brought forward today, is Wayne's story and this context of conservative politics, I think, tell us a lot about why we are so divided today in the United States. And if you just look at an electoral map of Trump's victory, it kind of makes sense. Geography plays an important role in the political fracturing of America that we see today. Now, Wayne's story originates in certain historical phenomena taking place at the larger national level, of course, namely the aforementioned civil rights struggles for multitudinous groups and the continuance of the New Deal state here. But it has to be understood within the context of Hereford and this threat that the ACLU posed at the school, or this perceived threat, anyway, I should say, to the school or to the students, or to the migrant workers who might become radicalized or something like that. Now, again, despite my earlier claims, I just want to reemphasize, just sort of as I'm wrapping up here, that a lot of this really does originate in the 1930s. And the 30s are really important for understanding conservatism here and elsewhere. So sorry I'm doing this kind of complicated dance between Hereford and the larger United States and then back to Hereford, but it's kind of necessary. And in fairness, and I'm speaking as someone who, tends toward the left politically, in the 30s, I think liberals did condescend to conservatives a lot. And that charge does make a certain amount of sense. Some of you might be familiar with the famous film from 1936, The Plow That Broke the Plains, which was by the filmmaker Per Lorentz, which was funded by the Works Progress Administration, which was an arm of the New Deal. That basically, if you watch this film, unfortunately I don't have a clip. I should have brought a clip tonight, but this film is a propaganda tract at best, but it's a sort of a political blame game at worst. So what you get in this Lorentz film, that the people who were in the center of the Dust Bowl, aka people who were on the Southern Plains, that it was their inability to farm properly that caused the economic crash and downturn in rural America, right? That they tilled the soil too much and that they didn't take care of it. It was their inability to govern themselves properly that necessitated intervention by the federal government. And it was their Anglo-American monolithic society that was out of touch with the seeming diversity of the emerging modern American multi-ethnic society. Of course, FDR didn't do that much for blacks, but everybody knew where his sympathies lay. Probably because of Eleanor, who was the real energy behind mobilizing the black vote in the South for the Democratic Party in the 30s. Of course, Panhandle Texans would react negatively against this. But the extreme localism of rural communities like those found in the Panhandle really, I think, defined, and this is really the ultimate point here, on a fundamental level for people who lived in these spaces, what it meant to be an American. If there's one overarching lesson as I work through this project about Wayne, as I contextualize it, I guess I should say, that I've learned, it's that the modern political fracturing between conservatives and Republicans is really a question of identity more than it is anything else, or quite simply what it means to be an American in a globalizing and rapidly changing world where you've got more integration than we've ever seen before. So in other words, feel free to argue with me on this point. It's not really for conservatives about tax cuts or evangelical religion or small government. And it's not even really for my side of the fence about social welfare or diversity. Fundamentally, it's about what it means to be an American and how people need to understand American society and their place in it. I really believe that that's true. Now, a little bit more on the microscopic and very wide context, just sort of a couple of ideas that I'll throw out here. This kind of rugged, individualistic, frontier identity that defined what it meant to be an American or a conservative person by Wayne's time in the 1970s, I think really dates back from the initial settlement of this region by Euro-Americans. I've done a little bit of research into this, and I first became conscious of this idea in looking at the records of the Panhandle Plains Historical Society at WT, which gives me a nice opportunity to plug the museum down there, which you should all visit because it's fantastic. For example, the PPHS, some of my colleagues at WT are members of this organization today, was founded in Canyon in 1920. It made explicit in its constitution its own aims at celebrating frontier identity. Recorded in the first article of its constitution is the following. This is a direct quote. The organization shall endeavor to present to the coming generation the life of the old settler in such a way that it shall create in them the desire to uphold forever the honor of the country that their forefathers wrought out of the wilderness. It's an interesting statement. Now, of course, those of us who teach history at WT, we know a little bit of institutional history, and one of the things that the organization then did in the 20s and 30s is it, rightly so, set out to collect oral interviews with the then dying pioneer generation, the people who had settled this region in the 1870s and 80s, who were quite elderly at the time. And I think it's no coincidence that the historian who headed this up was none other than J. Evetts Haley. I don't know if any of you know who J. Evetts Haley was. J. Evetts Haley was a professional historian who was also one of the architects of this region's far-right conservative political outlook in the 1950s and 60s. For example, in 1961, he called publicly for Chief Justice Earl Warren to be hanged because of his status on racial politics. And then he ruined his academic career in 1964 by writing a book called A Texan Looks at Linden, which some of you are probably familiar with, which was allegedly, it's one of the highest selling political histories or political books in American history. Maybe it'll be passed by Wolf's recent book, which is flying off the shelves. But it was and I don't mean this as a political person. I mean this as a historian. It was a hack job. It's a bad book. It was a political hit job against the then president of the United States, disguised as scholarship, which it was not. But nonetheless, Haley and his views and his critiques of the central government were quite popular. All right, so long story short, Wayne was a threat to this now sort of 50 years old sort of kind of frontier protectionism that had swept through this region. This idea that we can keep the rest of the country out or at bay. Thanks, Tad. But the culture wars, as well as the microscopic challenge to conservative hegemony, sort of embodied by Wayne's court case, I think not only shed light on these fractured dynamics between modern conservatism and liberalism, but a lot of these ideas do stem from rural conservatives' perceptions that there isn't one America, but there's in fact two. And I think, as this map shows, that's probably true, right? There is also, and I'll just sort of breeze through this because I'm getting the signal that I'm out of time, a longer history of rural America that's worth, or really rural spaces that I think are worth mentioning before I finish. I think tribalism is something that's a part of human nature, right? And if you look at the histories of agricultural communities in the Western world, going back to the Roman Empire, there's always this notion that we have to protect our community from the dangers of outsiders who don't understand it. People with even the appearance of bucking the social order in a rural agricultural community, Roger Williams in the 17th century, Anne Hutchison, obviously, who was an even greater threat to Puritanism in the 17th century, stood to threaten the very functionality of rural social orders, whether they were racial or political or whatever. One need not cast a gaze towards such notable actors questioning systems of order to establish the kind of primacy of local-minded politics and guardianship in rural communities. So Wayne's story offers, I think, a compelling microhistory of belonging and democracy in rural communities. Notions of community protection and belonging became amplified during the travails of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the resulting fears of too much government economic interventionism in the region under FDR and the New Deal. A few decades later, Wayne, excuse me, I have Woodward typed up in my notes. Wayne was a child of the Civil Rights era and a sharp critic of certain aspects of this emerging conservative political economy in the region, and to them he served as a sort of stand-in for these larger trends in urban America on both coasts, which the far-right conservative political culture of this region against which it had coalesced, thus resulting in these interpretations by many of the locals that Wayne was out of touch with the community. And he constantly heard, just circling back around to his story, this repeated during the 1970s: "You don't belong. You'll never be one of us. Go teach in New York or California. You're not a part of the community here. You've been knocked out." So that's basically it. I mean, the emerging political and cultural fissures present in Hereford during the mid-70s, I think, represent a kind of new beginning in modern U.S. history. Reasons for this, of course, stem from the continued integration of the world through the adoption of continuously improving communications technology, obviously. Is nationalism under threat, as Trumpist conservatives or pro-Brexit people would say? I think certainly conservatives have embraced the language of nationalism far more aggressively than liberals have. And again, look no further than Trump or Brexit as evidence of this. But Wayne's case offers a serious point of departure for when the modern political divide in the United States was just entering into its historical infancy. And obviously it's still growing and maturing today. Thank you very much.